Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, or good middle of the night, wherever you are. This is week 2 of Enterprise Risk and Data Analytics. I'm going to get all videos posted on Sunday, the start of the second week, so stick with me. I also want to post a very interesting article about how data analytics, open source data that someone posts about how well they like or dislike working on Glassdoor is now being used to assess companies, to give you an idea of how we see data analytics going on in our daily work life and aren't aware of it. But before we get to that, we want to talk a little bit about what I mean by data analytics or risk analytics.
We say, is it low, medium, or high? It doesn't matter to say it's 90%
and I just have to find the right button to advance the slide. There we go.
We just say, is it low?
So we're talking about risk analytics and data analytics.
Knows my name.
Basically, analytics is how we
low criticality of the data.
Obtain,
medium would be
how
and perhaps
store and process
and
analyze and look at that data. So that's data analytics, and risk analytics is how we're looking at that data, looking for risk. So that's what you're going to see from this Glassdoor article.
A lot of times we fall back on the qualitative
notion. Something I want you to keep in mind.
When we talk about
we use a couple of sets of definitions, and that is because risk science is actually an old science, and it came up with this terminology, and we're kind of changing the terminology. Cybersecurity risk uses its own terminology. So bear with me. Sometimes we'll call it a hazard. Sometimes we'll call it an impact, severity or an impact or hazard. That's because I want you aware of some of the classic nomenclature, but at the same time, I want you to be aware that, as I've said before, this is a new and exciting area brought by the perfect storm of three things. First of all, the advances in hardware technology that we can cheaply store mounds of data.
Or when we talk about
the advances in software technology that we can go out and get data all over the place, scrape it off Facebook and social media, analyze it off databases, take it off the supply chain metrics, look at logs for how systems perform.
That's tough to quantify.
And then the third leg of the stool, which people sometimes forget, is the advances in mathematics that has given us the underlying ability to develop very powerful data analytics.
We're on the tipping point.
Algorithms. So here's a little something I learned a long time ago when I was getting my PhD. When a field is new, we haven't settled on the terminology. So we'll use old terms and new terms, and sometimes the new terms will be used incorrectly because we haven't yet settled on the terminology, because the field is developing and evolving. So part of this is going to be, okay, we're going to use the same terms for different
the ones that will pioneer will be the ones
concepts. But it's like people calling a car an automobile, or enterprise was once called a horseless vehicle, right? You have this historical terminology that gets applied as new terminology.
But then here's the problem with that.
So we want to talk about a little bit about the history and importance, because this is not new. Risk analytics goes back to the beginning of civilization, because frankly, to survive, you have to be able to consider and analyze risk. I mentioned this
regarding the importance of financial risk.
In one of my first lectures, where I said when I teach cybersecurity risk, I always ask people how many of themselves consider themselves risk experts. No one ever puts up their hand, and then I point out to them that in their daily life, they are constantly accessing, monitoring, analyzing, and managing risk. We all have to do it. We all have to do it, and we do it in all aspects of our life. But because it's so common, we don't realize that. We don't realize how much we know about risk.
It was huge compared to what we have, right?
I know, again, I'm putting a lot of words on the slides. I think I need to break that.
Even though you
tendency, but basically this is just, it studies the underlying uncertainty of a decision or course of action, and we live in a world of uncertainty.
Mr. Osborne was a smart guy.
So when we talk about risk analytics, it's continuous, but it's also dynamic. The risk can change. Something happens last week, and I read 4 or 5 commentators that say we're heading for a recession.
It's going to be lighter. It's going to be faster.
And then something happens and the market shoots up, and I read a commentator that says, oh, no, we're in for a great ride. And yet somebody else says, no, we're just getting ready for a fall, right? They're trying to analyze the continuous dynamic nature of risk. And so what we're going to talk about this week is just the commonality of risk assessments, whether it's
the best example.
a simple decision matrix, here's what I think is going to happen. Here's the probability. Here's what I need to do if it happens. To what's emerging is our artificial intelligence training system processing. So now we have a system that can analyze way too much data, terabytes and terabytes of data, and apply what has been built by a human. No AI systems, purely artificial intelligence.
So while it's
there has to be a human in there developing the algorithm or the like.
We need to look at that again
what
when we
it
talk
comes
about
up with.
holistic risk management.
So let's talk about the basics.
Talking about that with our
We talk
other
about
two
hazards,
big
and by
ones,
hazards,
strategic
we
and
mean risk
operational.
factors, hazards being the old term. We talk about probability. All risk is probabilistic in nature.
We can't
All
think of every
risk.
possible risk.
What's
and
the
like I said before,
probability
there's some
I'm
risk
going to
that
get
we can't worry about.
hit by a car the next time I cross the street?
we
Might
don't
be
wanna
very small,
overwhelm
but there's
to
a
where we're
probability.
collecting so much
What's the
data and doing so much
probability
data
I'm
analytics, we've
going
got the
to
old, paralysis through analysis.
have lunch with a friend
so
and order a hamburger?
we targeted like 30
that's
key
that's
risks here.
cascading
That's what we're hoping
probabilities.
our ontology
But
will
everything
show
is
us. And by the way,
probabilistic,
my
right?
next lecture,
Because
I'm
we're
working on some
constantly
slides
making
now to
new
better get some
decisions.
graphics for ontology.
And the severity is what we
My
often
problem
call
is
what
I'm
I
not a
call
very good visual
impact.
person, but
So we have our risk
basically,
factors.
what are the
What are
foundation
those
of
things that can
decision-making
cause
within
us
the company?
problems?
And
And what is the
also
probability of
remember
those
this,
happening?
emerging.
But we
What is
always,
emerging
always,
as a
always, if you
risk?
get nothing out
If
of
you're
this
in the
class,
financial
the
area,
basic is
if you're in,
you
if
have to
keep
look at the
personal
impact. When we
identifiable
talk about the risk,
information,
when we talk
look
about
at
the
what's happening
probability,
in
we
Europe when
always
they
want to
passed
talk
general
about the
data protection
consequence, the
regulation in
severity, the impact.
2018.
I don't like the word
GDPR,
severity
an
because
emerging
sometimes I
trend
think
that
it
you're going to have to take
leads
into
people to
account
incorrectly
is
assume
other
that something really
countries'
bad has to happen.
legislation that uses
Something
what we
really
call
bad doesn't
extraterritorial
have to happen.
jurisdiction to
Something
reach
might
into United
happen,
States
but
businesses,
further
United
down the
States-based
line, as
businesses,
we go through this complicated
and
network
that's
of
a
risk
risk.
factors,
It's a compliance risk. It's a legal
we
risk. It could be a
might
cyber
lead
risk
to something
because of the nature of the
more
law that
severe
was passed,
consequence.
with
So
draconian
I like to call
penalties for
impact.
violating the law.
Okay, so my slide got a little
Sim Siegel's the only
offset here
person
with
who I
the
looked through
hazard
several
risk,
kind of
but
books, and even that this
basically
book is kind
what
of
we
old,
do is
but-
we look at the
but he was
probability,
the
we
only
look at the
one that we could
severity or the
find that
impact, and we come up with an
talked about
estimation,
the myth of
and then
the
we look at the
financial risk.
criteria, and then we say, okay,
confusing the
how are
source
we
of the
going to
risk with
evaluate
its
that
outcome,
risk? And
or
why do, again, we
confusing
want to
what you
evaluate
think
that
about
risk.
the risk.
We want to
Remember,
evaluate
risk,
it
every time you
so
hear
we
the word
can
risk,
now
what do you gotta
say,
think about impact.
do we
It's
accept
synonymous
it?
for outcome.
Do we avoid it? Do we mitigate it? Do we transfer it?
And also,
So hazards
because
are potential
companies
sources of
publicly
harm, and they don't
traded
have
by
to be
federal
only
law
capable of
and the
causing
SEC
harm.
are required to
So that's what I don't
submit
like
or,
about the term
periodic
hazards. Like I
financial
said,
statements.
something can be
This is another reason why
an
we look at the
intermediate impact,
financials,
and it may or may not,
here's
down
the
a
problem with that.
cascading
The
line of
financials
risk,
give us
have
one
a
metric,
compact,
one viewpoint.
an impact. Might have a
Yes, an
compact
important
too.
aspect.
And risk is a
Company
probability that exposure to that
Stay in
hazard
business
will
long
cause
or an
harm.
enterprise
And just,
if it's losing
excuse me,
money,
remember what I said.
it doesn't have
Risk
cash on
is
hand.
the
However,
probability of loss.
You have to be careful.
That's
with
my
blinders,
little
that you get
definition I
only
give my
focused on
undergraduates in
that.
cybersecurity. I give them simple little definitions
So
for
this is
vulnerability
just a
for
think
exploit when
question
we're
for
talking
you.
specifically about cybersecurity, and it's a
If we say,
probability
hey,
of a
here's the
loss.
30 risks we're going to look
And
at.
so you can't see all
You know,
the
what are
slide here,
some
but
issues?
basically it says, a
You,
chainsaw
as
might
risk
be a
managers.
hazard to one
Maybe some
logger,
of these, there's
but
other risks that
lightning
pertain
may
to your
be a
business
hazard to
we haven't
someone
put on the
else.
list.
We our
Maybe we don't understand
hazards,
the
our
emerging trends
risk
in your business.
potential
One size
sources
does
of
not fit
harm
all.
differ
This is
from
not
what
a generic answer.
job we're doing.
So again, this
So
is a
hazards
thinking
can cause
analysis
harm,
type
but not
of
continuously. So
course.
what this is trying to say
So
is it's
what I tell
dynamic.
you,
So
this
the
is one
rate
course
of
where
probability
I
in
don't
which a
wanna use
hazard
the legal
causes harm
terms,
is
somebody
important.
asks you a question,
It will
depends.
change
But
over
there's-
time. Nothing
this is a
in
course
our
where we
world
don't
is
have the
static
answers.
anymore.
We really don't have the
So
answers.
we want to call that the
because
risk
they don't yet
probability,
exist.
and
We're
it's
trying
a
to
hazard
formulate
because of the
strategy.
risk. Something could happen.
Another
Like
key risk
I could be
focus
sitting
is
here
the
right
size
now
of
and
the
get hit by a
company. We
meteor.
tend to think the
or an
bigger it
asteroid.
is, the harder it'll fall kind
Probability
of thing.
It does exist. It's so close to being
This
zero
doesn't
that we
matter.
consider it
In
zero.
some ways, the small company,
But
and
out
the
in
large
space,
company
what this
are kinda
example
equal.
says is the
And
meteor
and
strike
how the
goes on
risk
all the
will
time, but
affect it.
kind
Now,
of who
the
cares
impact's
because
gonna
it's
be
out in
different.
space
You
and
have a
space is
billion-dollar
big and there's
company
nothing
that
there
has
for
a
it to
risk
harm.
and goes out of business, or you have a company
So the
that
risk
does
has a
50 million a year.
severity,
Okay,
an
the impact's
impact,
gonna be
and
different.
this is where it's important.
But
The examples
we
my
wanna be
students come up
careful
with are
assuming
really
that
very
there's,
basic
big
but very
companies
good.
got all these
Flammable
more
clothes
risk.
and gas
No,
soaked
we gotta
clothes
look
do
at
not
small
have the
and
same
medium
risk
enterprises.
severity.
And here's
right?
a couple reasons why.
Flammable
One
clothing
is
may have an
kind of
impact,
equal to a big company in,
but
in the risk
soaking your clothes in
assessment. The
gasoline
other is
is probably going to
cascading
have a
effect
worse
of the
impact.
small
Okay,
medium companies.
they use this about broken
If there's
issues for a
supplier
restaurant.
chain
That may
with a
be
larger
common, but its
enterprise.
severity is very low.
their
Remember,
risks
I made the
are
joke about
not
when I showed up at the
any
nice
less,
dinner at a nice restaurant
smaller
wearing two
risk,
different colored, mismatched
less of an
shoes.
impact. In some ways,
The
they
risk
could
you're going to
have
do
a bigger
something,
impact.
may be
because they could actually
there, but the
cause a
impact's
risk
so
to a
low,
larger
it doesn't
enterprise,
matter.
and the larger
Whereas if
enterprise has to
I
account for that. One of the risks they'll have
were
is
in
in their
a
supplier chain.
safety area and I wore my open-toed heel shoes instead of my
Kind of saying the same
required safety boots.
At the end of the day,
severity or impact could be much more.
Kind of pyramid. CEO in a small business.
So the
might
probability
also
of
be the guy
occurrence
who has
plus
the board of
its
directors
severity
that's
is a risk
publicly owned, or
estimation.
She may be the
And I'm going to
senior
tell you
manager.
right now, and
I've
I'm going to
had
say
small
this again and
businesses
again. We're in an
started
exciting
on
time
ones we thought
because
we were gonna have
nobody
8
knows how to
employees,
really
it
do
grew to
this. You are
15,
on the
30 to
forefront
25,
of
it grew to
new
40. One day I woke
work
up and I had
in
like
risk
90 people on the
analytics
payroll, right?
because
At
of
the
the
same time,
rapid
there
changes
was
in
the same
technology,
2 or
those three
3
that I
owners
mentioned,
in the
the
beginning
hardware,
were
the software,
running
and the
the business.
mathematics.
The pyramid was getting
So
wider,
we
not
are
taller.
learning more and more about risk. If anyone tells you, "Oh, I'm a risk
Another
manager,"
problem
we
we
got
have
that down.
is
We've got a
risk
process. We
management
go do
programs
this and
that
this. Ho
deal
hum. I go home at
with
night. Never miss
one
a night's
aspect.
sleep.
So it's kind of like
I
put
have
your
a
goggles
video
on.
somewhere of a
I'm an
risk
HR
I did
person
with
for
so
my
I see of
everything
U of
is
H
people
students
risk.
who's a risk
I
manager,
myself
and I
am
was
a
doing
technology person.
cybersecurity
How
for
many of my
Deloitte, and I
examples
will
have
see
been
if I
from
can dig that up
technology
and post
companies,
it.
right?
Because
I
of
see
some
it
of
as
the
an IT
problems
risk,
that
or I
occur.
see it as a cyber
Just
risk.
things change. Things can
We
change
have to be
overnight.
careful of this.
So
we have to be able to
it's
look at
a
the different
probability of
viewpoints.
occurrence,
We have to be able to
but
look at the different
and the severity of its
organization, the
risk, but these
enterprise
are hard
goals,
factors to come
the
up with.
products,
What is going
what
to
all
be
feeds into
that
The HR,
probability,
yeah,
and what's going to be the
important
severity?
component. IT, yeah, important component. The manufacturing, yeah.
So our
important
risk
component.
managers and strategic
because of our
managers
background,
decide
we
when
have to
risk
be
is too
careful
much
not
and
to
what
let
is
that put
acceptable
our
in areas of
blinders
their
on and
company.
look at the
That's
totality of
that's
the
a
problem.
public line. In reality,
So
every
again,
single worker
when we talk about different
is
risk
handling
types,
risk
there's
in
this
some way,
interdependence.
whether
We're
they are
trying to
aware
work
of it
out
or
these
not.
relationships.
It is the duty of the risk manager to put together a
bad things can
strategy to be
happen.
able to
Another
identify
example,
those risks,
Volkswagen
to be able
had a
to capture
systematic
their
problem in
criteria,
their
to be able to
company.
analyze it so they can
And this
evaluate
really
it.
disappoints me as a former software engineer.
And then we have the risk
put in
estimation. And
software
again,
code to
we
circumvent
are
accurately
doing
and
the best we
honestly
can.
reporting
We can
emission
do it
statements.
quantitatively, meaning we can put
Now,
numbers on it, or
Somewhere
we can
along the
do
line,
it
this just isn't
qualitatively.
one
And I
person.
used this example
There's a
before,
few
but I'll
key
go back
people
to
who
it.
have
I
gone to
work in
prison over this.
cybersecurity. When we talk about
Volkswagen,
data,
there had to be a
we
team
talk
of people.
about
There had to be developers
the
in this, there
criticality
had
of
to be
data,
people
low,
who were
medium,
testing the
high. We
software.
do
There
not
was
try
more.
to assess
wasn't just one
numbers.
bad
If
actor
the
in
data is
Volkswagen. This was
critically
many bad
high, it
actors
gets
in
the
Volkswagen.
most
At the
stringent,
end of the day,
strict
the CEO, the
protection.
higher-ups are the ones that
Doesn't
are
matter if
gonna
it's
pay.
85% critical,
But my
99%
point is,
critical.
there's this real-world
Right?
complexity.
We just use
and-
low,
and
medium,
look what
high
they
because of
did.
the difficulty
They
of
altered
looking
the
at data and
software
saying,
to say
well,
that
is
their
this 20%
emissions
critical? Is this 35% critical? By the
were
way, where's the
within
line
acceptable
between low and
reached,
medium?
legislative
So what would
statutory
cause risk
constraints.
estimation to gauge a
Small-term
risk higher than
impact,
its
I read
risk
a news study that
criteria?
says it
And this
causes 8
happens a
more
lot of
people in the
times when
United
people are
Kingdom or in
using their
Britain to die of
experience
cancer.
or something
Well,
recently
people
that has
doesn't sound like
happened,
much. Look at
and
it
they
from Volkswagen's
overestimate
perspective.
risk.
They knowingly lied.
I've
they
heard this
misled.
before, that we, because of
Some of them
social
went to
media,
prison. They are being
emphasizing
fined.
certain
Every city
things,
and state
that
in
we
the
tend to
United
think we
States
live in a much
is
more
suing
dangerous
them.
world and all these
City
things
Houston's
happen,
suing
when
them.
in reality our statistics show
reputation, when I think of Volkswagen
it's
now,
less
I think
dangerous.
fraud. I don't think those
we
cute
use
little Beetles
experiences,
I
we
drove when I was in
use
college.
anecdotal
and so
information. Well,
we have
the
to be
house
also
down the street
careful
got
that
broken
something
into, and
like
this happened, and
that,
this happened. So therefore, crime must be going up. The risk of it
needs
to
to be a
my
book
house
written
has
on this or
gone up.
something.
The
Was
risk
this a
may have gone up
strategy that
because
came
of
from
other
the CEO?
factors:
Was
the
this
neighborhood,
the head of engineering
leaving the
that was
doors
under,
unlocked, not having a security system,
constraints
not
and
having
wanting
a
to
dog,
have his performance
leaving your valuables in clear
within
view,
what was considered
so they
acceptable
might
by
be
the company?
enticing,
I don't know.
creating an
But
opportunity. But the risk
lesson for all of
estimation,
us
many
is
times
we
we
can't just
talk
look at
about and
anything
we
in
overly
isolation.
estimate risk
A bad
because we're
group of
not looking at it
engineers and
in
software
a
programmers
clear,
made some
analytical
very bad
manner.
illegal decisions, and it affected the enterprise.
So hazards have a chance to cause harm. So
and
that's
it's
the
inefficient
impact.
because if
And
you're
this
not
has a probability
looking
and a
at that in the
severity.
totality,
But we want to
you
keep
might
on
be
mind
focusing
that
on
we
risk and
are
trying to fix
looking at
that, and on
this
the enterprise level,
as
it's not having the
something
effect you
that
wanted.
is
That's the
evolving.
overpaying.
And that is the
When
purpose of this
undercommunicating will
class.
be,
I'm not going to
did
say,
this
here is a
software
step-by-step
sector that was
process, and
developing
if you
this,
do
was
this, you
this
will be
being
able to
communicated to
analyze
other
risk.
sectors?
I
No,
want to
the
create a
PR the
framework
PR know about it.
that as you go
The legal
forward in
know
your
about it. You know,
career, or in
hopefully
your
not,
job,
because if
in your
so, there ought to be a
promotions and
number of whatever, you have a framework to adapt to the changes that we see in hardware, in software, and in mathematics. Thank you for staying with us. I will process this video and get it
and not
on
communicate
line and have a happy
outside.
Sunday. Now, obviously, people aren't going to say, "Hey, I'm checking, I'm lying in my software code," right? But at the same time, as I said before, this isn't a couple of people. You've got a software designer, you've got the coders, you've got the testers, you've got the validators. You have a ton of people who Knew or should have known. And by the way, those are becoming very important legal terms now. It used to be, did you know? Now it's, did you know or should have known? Was it within your job purview to know this was going on? So it's just a bad thing. It's bad all the way around. You can't defend this whole silo approach where I'm going to run my section in isolation. You're part of the enterprise. That section is part of the enterprise and contributes to that risk. But here's the problem that we have again. We try to not aggravate, that's a Freudian slip, aggregate a metric. We want to have an overall metric. We want somebody to just tell us, because otherwise we're looking at this vast, complex network of enterprise risk factors. And we want to say, just tell me, what's is it a 5? Is it a 10? Is it a 15? What does that mean? What does that mean for your risk factors? So we try to target and we try to understand how that fits. But because we're going to look at it as the strategic, the financial, the operational, and all the underlying risk, it's really hard to come up with a set of metrics that accurately produce what we need to know to make good business decisions. So we can calculate metrics. We can give you all the numbers we want. We can carry them out to as many decimal points as you want. But you know what? If it's bad data, garbage in, garbage out, it's not going to tell you what you need. And so part of this class is to investigate, because people will bring technologies to you and say, hey, we have all this data. Let's take all this data. If we analyze it and process it, store it, visualize it, we're going to get the answers. And you have to be able to say, wait a minute, is this technology applicable here? Where's this data coming from? Is the data valid? How did you set this analysis up? If you're not aware of it, right now there's a big issue in algorithm development. There's a book called Algorithms of Oppression. It started out that machine learning, and we'll talk about this when we talk about machine learning, uses data to train. So it started out, it used bad test data. So quite frankly, if you were going to build a market segment or predict people being in a hospital or something like that, and you don't accurately define your data sets, then the system's going to train on invalid data. So for instance, in HR, they trained systems and they found they were inherently biased against women and those from underrepresented groups, because they had trained that on data, but primarily white males, because that was the data that was available. Okay, computers can't do magic. You have to tell them what to do. You have to set something up. They can't invent this. Yesterday or today, I just read on the news where now there is a algorithm that has been found to be used in medical care that prioritizes patient triaging in the wrong order. Again, it's a technical issue, okay? My point is, we want metrics, we want to make it easy, we want to have numbers as managers to look at. From a technical viewpoint, you need to know which questions to ask about where that data comes from. And then it's more about than just risk reporting, okay? I'm going to give you my risk. I'm going to tell you, bye, see you in 6 months. It's a continuous monitoring. Something may change tonight. I may go home tonight, get up tomorrow, pick up my Wall Street Journal or New York Times or one of my many blogs I read and say, oh my gosh, everything I thought got changed because fill in an event, okay? So first of all, it has to be continuing risk assessment and managing. And then once you've analyzed and found the risk, guess what? When you mitigate or use one of your 4 strategies, the dynamics change and you're constantly having to go back to see how the risk changed. So mitigation is very interesting. It's running the business, it's being compliant, it's looking for opportunities, and it's doing this in a dynamic environment. No, we don't have the luxury of even saying, hey, come for the next 24 hours, nothing changes so I can kind of get a handle on what I'm going. No, we put in trades or tariffs as a government policy and it affects our business. There's a court decision that comes down. Court decisions come down every day. I try to keep monitoring on them. Some of them are binding, some are what we call persuasive. They might not be in our appellate district in the U.S., but they may be something that our appellate district says, they got it right, and we're going to incorporate that. And then when we disclose it, how do we disclose it so it makes sense? How do we disclose it so stakeholders can make intelligent decisions? The SEC material rule for publicly traded companies says that we have to disclose a risk that could be of material to making a decision whether to invest in the company. Well, okay, so there's very clever art sometimes to presenting data that no one seems to really understand the content or the meaning of, right? But as it says here, improperly disclosing risk can have huge implications. The SEC can come after you, the FTC can come after you, government regulators can come after you, the media can come after you. And this all leads to risk. It's an important component of how we value companies. How can they manage risk? Look at Apple. How many times has Apple been on the ropes that it could have gone bankrupt? Dell Computer came within one summer of going bankrupt. I think in the early 80s or something, one man gave up a trip to Europe to put the company back on keel because they said it's not going to last. Every company at some point risks completely going bankrupt or under. They are having to reinvent themselves. This isn't just a PR or marketing. This is going back and looking at the risk. IBM still survives after 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. They constantly reinvent themselves, but they're not just. It's not a PR. It's not like, okay, today we're going to call ourselves this. It's part of their strategy. It's part of understanding their risk. It's part of, they got rid of their laptop business when it became a commodity. They sold it to a Chinese company. So all this goes to the underlying thing that we are a capitalist country. Companies need to have value because they need to make money for their shareholders. They need to treat their stakeholders correctly, and they need to be profitable. So shareholders is the primary stakeholder, but by no means are they the only stakeholder. Okay, we have regulators, we have the general public. A controversy I got into a few years ago at another university, we were talking about who the customers were of that university, and people said the students. And I said, no, the students are stakeholders. They benefit from what we're doing, but the ultimate customer is the state of Texas, who funds a large part of that public university, but also the public at large and the industry that we're creating future workforce for. But we are not going to tailor what we do to the students as the customers. They are stakeholders, but they are not who ultimately will consume what we're producing. It's the kind of way I looked at it. That's going to end that. Thank you for staying with me. Be back with you soon.